I'm now very happy to welcome Mara Bellaby, who is the executive editor of Florida Today. Today we're going to be talking about what I learned in journalism and why I'm still an optimist, and thank goodness for that. Mara Bellaby, thank you so much for being with us today. Come on up.
All right. In the 1999 film The Matrix, humanity is unknowingly trapped in a simulated reality. People believe they're living ordinary lives. They're going to work, falling in love, raising families, but their bodies are being used as an energy source. The real world is in a terrible shape, but they don't see it. They're offered a choice. They can take the blue pill and remain comfortable, or they can take the red pill and see reality, even when it's complicated and unsettling. Journalism to me has always felt like taking the red pill. And some days I totally get the appeal of the blue one, but I still prefer reality, even messy. Which brings me to what journalism, my career over 30 years, has taught me about humanity, and why, despite everything, I remain an optimist. But first, let me tell you just a little bit about who I am. I've spent more than 3 decades as a journalist, starting as a news assistant in upstate New York, back when cities still had morning and afternoon newspapers. I learned from tough, old-school editors who swore loudly in the middle of the newsroom. I covered City Hall. I covered Rochester, New York's first black mayor. Then I left the country, first London with the Associated Press, and then Russia, also with AP, during Vladimir Putin's early rise to power. Covering Russia, I watched freedoms contract, journalists disappear or wind up dead. Terror attacks became routine, and whole segments of Russian society were demonized. I covered uprisings across the former Soviet Union as people sought to emulate what we had in the United States. And then after years away, I came home. I came to Florida. And today I'm executive editor of Florida Today. 15 years ago this week, I stood at Kennedy Space Center helping lead our team's coverage of the final shuttle flight, Atlantis. We thought we were documenting an ending, and in some ways we were. But journalism keeps teaching me endings are rarely just endings. They become the beginning of the next story. Since then, we've watched a new era of spaceflight emerge. Last year alone, our team covered 109 launches. This year, we covered Artemis 2 as a crew flew around the moon. And just this week, I sat down for a long interview with the former shuttle launch director for a bigger story I'm working on later this summer about what it means to make decisions when everything is on the line. So a lot has changed in journalism in the US over the years. At Florida Today, we're a lot smaller than we used to be. As journalists, we face much harsher criticism, and getting information is more challenging. But what has not changed is our team's commitment and passion for what we do. So I'd like to share with you some of what I've learned. I'll call it 5 things journalism has taught me about humanity. Number 1, our assumptions are almost always incomplete. Journalism teaches you to trust your instincts, but to never trust your assumptions completely. Assumptions are seductive. They feel efficient and they feel smart, and they're often wrong. Let me give you an example, and I'm going to reach back to the beginning of my career. I was a fairly new reporter in upstate New York. I was working at the Corning Leader at the time. There'd been a really bad accident, a police chase in snowy conditions. The chase ended with a fiery crash into the trees off the side of a mountain in the southern tier, killing the driver of the car who was trying to evade the cops. It was pretty standard police brief, and as a new reporter, it was probably one of 3 or 4 stories I was working on that day. The chase happened late at night after the bars closed. It started on a stretch of highway where police had been making a lot of drunk driving arrests. We'd been writing about that. In this instance, according to the cops, they saw someone driving erratically. They put on their lights and sirens, but the car sped up instead of stopping. The police pursued. The car went faster. The police went faster, for miles. The driver lost control, plummeting off the road and slamming into a tree. Police speculated off the record that the guy was drunk, but toxicology report was still pending. I found the driver's number and called his house, hoping to talk to his family. No answer. This was back when we still all had answering machines, so I left a message. And then my deadline came. I wrote a story. I'd left out the off-the-record stuff, but basically it was just a pretty straightforward police chase story. Police chase, guy didn't pull over, guy crashes and dies. That was my story, start to finish. I moved on. The next day, I'm not sure what made me decide to follow up, I wasn't even really planning on writing another story, not yet anyway. I would write something when the toxicology report came back. But for some reason, I tried calling the guy's house again. Again, no answer. So on my way home, I thought I'll just drive by. So I drove out there, and these homes were really out of the way, the kind of places with lots of private and posted and stay out signs. And as soon as I got deep up the road, I knew I'd made a mistake. I had a little car with no snow tires. The road was largely unplowed. The snow was really thick and had that black ice underneath. It was getting dark, and I wasn't totally sure where I was going. I finally found his driveway, which was really steep, and stupidly I tried to drive up it. My car slid, and I got stuck sideways at the bottom of his driveway. It wasn't a good situation. I was really nervous. I was pretty sure the guy's family didn't want to talk to me. They hadn't called me back. Post-it signs were tacked all over his yard. And now here I was having to walk up the hill, knock on the door, and say, my car's stuck at the end of your driveway. And by the way, I'm a journalist. I was right. They didn't want me there. And the woman who answered, the driver's widow, wasn't at all friendly. But because I was stuck in her driveway, she couldn't tell me to just get lost. So in between talking about how she and her son were going to dig me out, we talked very awkwardly about her husband. And I learned he was an automotive instructor at the community college. He'd been dealing with some health issues. He didn't drink. He hadn't for years, and he was really proud of that. He hadn't been at a bar that night. He'd been working late with students. Now, this story didn't have a neat ending. His wife had no idea why he didn't pull over when the cop turned on its lights. It wasn't like him at all, she said. She was angry at the cops for chasing him. Why couldn't they have just gotten his license plate number and followed up? But she was also angry at him for not pulling over, for speeding up. It was just horribly tragic, this awful confluence of the cops giving chase and the guy not stopping. And as the woman and I talked, her teenage son wiped away tears. And that really stayed with me. It reminded me that stories don't end when we publish them. They continue in kitchens and classrooms and families long after the journalists move on. And so suddenly this neat story, neat in the sense of it had a narrative that made sense, just collapsed. And what I was left with was something messier and more human. It definitely wasn't the police narrative. The widow gave me a photograph of her husband that she wanted me to use in the follow-up story. Later, I asked if I could keep it. She said yes. I still have it. I wanted it, not because I wrote a great story. I didn't. But because it reminded me that behind every headline is a person whose life is far more complicated than our first draft. The story taught me something else too, how easily systems default to convenience. The police narrative made sense. It fit. And that's exactly why it was so important to push beyond that assumption. Now, the second big lesson I've learned took me a little longer to understand. Number 2, people become human when they're heard, so listen to them. One of the things I once overheard an editor say is this: if a journalist is writing a story about you and you want to complicate it, talk to them. The moment a source speaks, they introduce fear and hope and history and contradiction and motivation. And suddenly, as journalists, we have responsibility to do something hard. We have to try to understand. It's so much easier to say so-and-so refused to talk. To actually have to try to understand them and why they're doing what they're doing, that takes work. And this is true beyond journalism. It's remarkably difficult to demonize someone who's standing in front of you, talking to you, not at you, especially when you start talking about your kids or their job or their worries or their health. There's a former Brevard County commissioner, who I won't name, but every time the person did something, I'd shake my head. Their actions made for a lot of news stories, and I couldn't understand how someone could think and act and say the things this person did. At some point after we'd written a string of stories, the commissioner called me to complain about their coverage. I defended it, and we decided to continue the discussion over Chinese food and Suntree. We somehow got talking about our childhoods and our families and vacations. And while I, sitting there at lunch, still had the same thoughts I'd had before about their public actions, I started to see the commissioner a little differently. Now, understanding didn't change our reporting, but it made me attentive. We were still going to report with a careful and often critical eye on this commissioner's actions and statements, but I didn't want us to turn this person into a caricature. That didn't serve our reporting, and it certainly didn't serve our audience. And this plays out in life too. I've watched people who thought they had nothing in common discover that they do share some things once the shouting stops and they start listening to each other. Now, maybe not enough to ever be friends or agree with each other, but enough to not demonize, and that matters. And now number 3, Mr. Rogers was right. Look for the helpers. They're always there. and they outnumber those seeking to create chaos or stoke fears. But the latter are real. There are bad people out there doing bad things, seeking bad outcomes. And as journalists, we don't help anyone by practicing what we call both-sidism. Not all views deserve equal weight. Some views and commentary and opinions cause harm, full stop. We can say that, and we should say that. But we don't help anyone by pretending that every person, if you just listen enough and engage enough, is good at heart. We live in a complicated world. We know that. But journalism has trained me to notice people doing good and to make sure we tell their stories too. Locally, I think of people like Bernard Bryan. He won our Volunteer of the Year award last year. Mr. Bryan's a retiree from Collins Aerospace. He's the South Brevard's NAACP's education chair. And he attends every school board meeting, mentors youth at University Park Elementary and Stone Magnet Middle. And for nearly a decade, he's run a program offering science classes to marginalized kids of all ages. It's important to hear about people like Mr. Bryan. It's important for us to know people like him are out there. And as a journalist, my job is to make sure we don't forget to tell those stories too. As a human, it helps me remind myself that those people are there. Now, this may be the most urgent lesson right now. Number 4, attention is an act of respect, and we're losing it. Journalism trains you to watch, to notice what's not said, to pay attention when something feels off. We live in a culture that rewards speed and certainty and outrage. And I'll be the first to be honest here. Many media outlets, including my own at times, have jumped right into that and fed that. It's easier, it gets page views. One time I was in a training session with a representative of Facebook, and they said every post should prompt someone to want to respond with an emoji. Maybe it's that face with the tears, or the angry one, or the heart. You want to drive emotion, they said. Yeah, maybe, but emotion without attention is just noise. Attention, real attention, requires patience, and patience is rare. Patience requires silence, it requires observation, it requires restraint. And some of the most important moments in reporting happen when nothing is being said. They happen in the pauses in conversations, in the quiet. We know how to pay attention, we just need to do it more. And now, this is where I often think and get asked, like, how can you still be optimistic? And I want to be clear as I talk about my number 5. Optimism is not ignorance. It's hope with eyes open. Optimism is not denial. It's not being naive. And it's certainly not acceptance of injustice. But optimism is the belief that people are more than their worst moment, and that truth, when pursued honestly, still matters. I don't do as much hands-on reporting as I did earlier in my career. So my optimism, thanks to journalism, often comes from talking to my colleagues or from talking to readers. It's the people who reach out to me because they think our readers should know about the 71-year-old man who rode his bike solo 3,438 miles across the country. He averaged about 40 miles a day, and as he told our reporter, Jennifer Torres, it was kindness that got him through. A religious group helped push him up a grueling hill. A woman on her porch waved him down just to offer water and conversation. Another man handed him a Gatorade and then said, "Camp on my property." Or I'm reminded of the struggling nonprofit whose story we featured, and later the director called to say they were overwhelmed by donations and offers of help after our story ran. Or a family who lost a child to violence, and I know our reporters are meeting them with the respect and dignity they deserve to tell that story. So soon I start to feel good about us again. Yes, journalism has shown me cruelty, but it has never convinced me cruelty is the whole story. And overwhelmingly, it has shown me ordinary people trying to do the best they can, often under really hard circumstances. Once you take the red pill, like I have, you don't get to go back. You have to see life that's messy and complicated and constantly changing, and not always how you want it to be. It's full of endings, but some of those can become beginnings. And with that insight comes responsibility to listen, to question, to seek truth, and to stay human. And I still believe that responsibility is worth it. Thank you.